So I left off talking about sickle cell disease, which is inherited by individuals and causes these sickle-shaped red blood cells, which don't flow through our capillaries as well as our normal disc-shaped red blood cells. Okay. So what we see in individuals that are heterozygous for this disease, okay, they can still make enough regular hemoglobin to keep their red blood cells fine. Individuals that are homozygous for the sickle cell mutation don't live as long. They've got a lot of issues with their blood vessels, their spleen, all sorts of issues. Okay, so they typically have reduced lifespans. Although those that are heterozygous usually do all right. We see in Central Africa, the allele is frequency about 0.12, so about 12% have this specific allele. 1% of people are homozygous, so have the actual disease. And we see 2 African Americans out of every 1,000 have this disease as well. Okay, so if natural selection drives evolution, why does this still exist? Okay, why has this disease not gone away? Okay, so the reason for this, and if you watch the video, you saw this, individuals that are heterozygous for this trait have protection against malaria. So malaria is a pretty bad disease, and it kills millions of people every year worldwide. It's especially bad in places like Africa. And so we see that individuals that still have this allele, this diseased allele, they're more likely to survive malaria than those that don't have any diseased alleles. And so we have this heterozygote advantage where they can make enough normal red blood cells that sickle cell disease doesn't hurt them. But then they also get this not quite immunity, but protection from malaria as well. And so these individuals still carry this trait. So we still get individuals with the disease that will die early from that. But then individuals that are homozygous for the normal red blood cells don't have any of the malaria protection. Okay? And so we see that where sickle cell is the most common also happen to be the places where we get a lot of malaria. Okay? Just an interesting thing that we see in humans. Okay? Speciation, this is macroevolution, where we're actually going from one species to a new species. And so we're getting changes where different populations are becoming more and more different from one another over time. Okay? If they become different enough, natural selection can do something so that they stay that way. So here we're going to look at the biological species concept, which basically looks at 2 groups of organisms, 2 populations that are reproductively isolated. So they can't breed with one another and produce viable offspring. Okay, so populations whose members do not mate with each other, cannot produce fertile offspring, are said to be reproductively isolated and are different species. So when we're looking at speciation, this macroevolution, we typically look at this biological species concept. Okay, and so we've got various mechanisms that keep organisms from reproducing with one another. So we've got prezygotic, which keep zygotes from forming, and then postzygotic, which keep those zygotes, if they do form, from either becoming adults or reproducing themselves. So we've got 6 prezygotic and then 1 postzygotic, and we'll go through each of these. Okay, so geographical isolation is prezygotic. Basically, these things live in different places, so they're not going to breed with one another. Okay, so they're too far away to even potentially interbreed. Ecological isolation, they live in the same general geographic region, but they live in different areas in that environment, and so it's unlikely that they're going to breed. Okay. So let's say you've got a bird that lives in the canopy and a bird that lives on the ground. They take advantage of different parts of that environment. So they're probably not going to try to interbreed. Okay. Lions and tigers live in some similar areas, okay, throughout mostly Asia, but they take advantage of slightly different habitats. So while they can interbreed, and they've done this in zoos, it's probably not going to happen naturally. Temporal isolation, we've got organisms live in the same place, but they've got different breeding season. So because these breeding seasons are different, we're not going to get any intermixing. Behavioral isolation, here we have mating rituals of different organisms. And so because a different species isn't going to do this same mating ritual, we're not going to get this interbreeding happening. Mechanical isolation, basically the parts don't fit. There are certain insects where the penis is a very specific shape and it will not fit into the female of a different species. And so this is mechanical isolation. Then prevention of gamete fusion. If we do get this reproduction happening, the sperm simply can't fertilize the egg. It just won't even happen. Okay. Here we've got some postzygotic isolating mechanisms. Okay. So in some hybrids, there's so much difference between the genes of these organisms that bred that you can't get normal embryonic development. So you get a zygote, but it will abort because it can't form something that's going to function. Some hybrids survive the embryo stage. They're not going to develop normally. So these are born, but you don't get normal development. And then some you get normal development, but they're sterile. You take a horse and a donkey, different species, you mate them, you get a mule. That mule functions totally normally, except it can't reproduce with any other organisms. The mule is sterile. Okay. And so that is the end of chapters 16 and 17 here, natural selection and evolution.